Would you notice if someone close to you was unleashing demons in your workplace for money? I never believed in ghosts until my stepbrother Marco started selling them to the highest bidder, and trust me, that is not a sentence I ever thought I would say out loud. The whole nightmare began 3 months after I inherited Grandma Rosalie's antique shop in downtown Portland. I had left my comfortable $65,000 a year curator position at the Oregon Historical Museum to honor her dying wish, keep the 40-year-old Westfield antiques running, and preserve what she called the family legacy. Looking back, I should have known something was wrong when customers started avoiding the shop like it was radioactive, but grief makes you blind to a lot of things. My name is Emma Westfield, and I am 31 years old, which means I am old enough to know better than to believe in supernatural nonsense, but apparently young enough to get scared out of my mind by things that go bump in the night. Before inheriting the shop, I spent 8 years cataloging historical artifacts and learning to spot authentic pieces from fakes, skills that proved surprisingly useful when dealing with paranormal investigators and cult members, though they never taught us about that part in museum school. Marco Sullivan is my stepbrother, 3 years older than me, and the kind of person who thinks everything can be solved with a good sales pitch and complete disregard for other people's feelings. His father married my mother when I was 12, which means I have had almost 20 years to watch him make terrible decisions and somehow blame everyone else when things go wrong. After college, he became a day trader, the kind who talks about cryptocurrencies at family dinners and always has a new get-rich-quick scheme that requires just a small loan to get started. When Grandma Rosalie passed away last November, she left the shop to me instead of Marco, which created the kind of family tension you could cut with a knife. The will specifically stated that she wanted someone who understood the historical value of the pieces, not someone who would sell them off for quick profit. Marco contested the will initially, but when his lawyer explained how ironclad Grandma's documentation was, he backed down and offered to help me run the business instead. That should have been my first red flag. The shop sits on a prime corner lot in the Pearl District, 3 stories of Victorian architecture that Grandma bought back in 1984 when the neighborhood was still affordable. The first floor houses the main showroom, filled with everything from Depression-era furniture to medieval tapestries. The second floor contains overflow inventory and restoration workspace. And the third floor was Grandma's apartment, which I moved into after quitting my museum job. The rent alone costs $8,750 per month, which means I need to clear over $35,000 every quarter just to break even, not counting utilities, insurance, and the dozens of other expenses that come with running a business. The total inventory is worth approximately $180,000, assuming I could find buyers for everything, which seemed increasingly unlikely as customers stopped showing up. During my first month running the shop, sales dropped by 40% compared to the same period the previous year. I attributed this to the transition period and my inexperience with retail, but by the second month, regular customers started making excuses to leave quickly or asking uncomfortable questions about whether anything felt different about the shop recently. Mrs. Chen, who had been buying Victorian jewelry from Grandma for over 15 years, actually crossed herself when she walked through the door and left without purchasing anything, which was completely unlike her normal behavior. When I asked what was wrong, she said something about the atmosphere feeling heavy and oppressive, like walking into a funeral home during a wake. Marco started spending more time at the shop during this period, offering to help with inventory management and customer relations while I learned the business side of things. He would arrive early in the morning before I came downstairs from the apartment, and often stayed late to organize the back rooms where we stored the most valuable pieces. His helpfulness should have made me grateful, but instead it made me suspicious, probably because Marco had never been helpful about anything in his entire life without expecting something in return. The paranormal activity started small and built gradually, like a slow leak that eventually floods your basement. At first, I noticed items moved from where I remembered placing them, always valuable pieces that ended up in different locations overnight. A Ming Dynasty vase would migrate from the secure display case to a random shelf, where an 18th century jewelry box would appear on the front counter when I was certain I had locked it in the back room. I blamed myself for the confusion, assuming the stress of learning a new business was affecting my memory, but then customers started mentioning strange experiences while browsing. A woman trying on vintage hats said she felt someone tugging at her hair when no one was standing behind her. A man examining a collection of antique pocket watches claimed he heard ticking from timepieces that had not worked in decades. The breaking point came during the 3rd month when 3 separate customers reported feeling violently nauseous while examining items in the back corner of the showroom, the area where we displayed our most expensive medieval artifacts. One elderly gentleman actually vomited on a Persian rug worth $4,000, and when I tried to comfort him, he kept apologizing and insisting that something in that corner made him feel like he was dying. That night, I stayed downstairs after closing to examine the items in that section more carefully, trying to figure out what could be causing such strong reactions. The collection included a 14th century ceremonial dagger, a set of illuminated manuscripts, several pieces of religious artwork, and a carved wooden box that Grandma always kept locked with a small brass key she wore around her neck. As I approached the wooden box, the temperature in the room dropped noticeably, and I could see my breath forming small clouds in the air despite the heater running at full capacity. When I tried to examine the lock, the brass mechanism felt ice cold against my fingertips, cold enough to cause actual pain, and I could swear I heard whispering voices coming from inside the box itself. I ran upstairs to the apartment and spent the rest of the night researching the history of every item in that corner, using my museum training to trace their provenance and previous ownership. Most of the pieces checked out as legitimate historical artifacts, but the wooden box had no documentation beyond a handwritten note from Grandma stating that it came from an estate sale in Salem and should never be opened under any circumstances. The next morning, Marco arrived at his usual early hour, and I confronted him about the missing documentation and asked if he knew anything about the box or why customers were getting sick. His reaction was immediate and defensive, which told me everything I needed to know about his involvement in whatever was happening. "Look, Emma, you are letting your imagination run wild here," Marco said, gesturing dismissively toward the corner where the box sat. "These old buildings have drafts and weird smells, and customers make up stories when they do not want to buy expensive things. Grandma probably just forgot to write down where she got that box. She was getting pretty forgetful toward the end." The temperature drop was not my imagination, Marco. I could literally see my breath, and that lock was cold enough to burn my skin. Old buildings have heating problems, and metal conducts cold air from outside. You are turning normal building maintenance issues into ghost stories because you are stressed about running the business. His explanations were reasonable enough to make me question my own perceptions, but his body language told a different story. Marco kept glancing toward the box while we talked, and his hands were shaking slightly, which only happened when he was lying about something important. I had seen that same nervous behavior when he tried to convince our parents that he had not crashed my car during senior year, right up until the police called with the accident report. Over the next 2 weeks, the paranormal activity escalated from mysterious cold spots to full-blown supernatural chaos that drove away what few customers still dared to enter the shop. Lights flickered on and off throughout the day, always when potential buyers were examining expensive items. Doors slammed shut with enough force to rattle the windows, and the sound of footsteps could be heard on the second floor when no one was up there. The most disturbing incident occurred when a young couple came in looking for an engagement ring from our vintage jewelry collection. While the woman was trying on a 1920s Art Deco piece, the ring suddenly turned black against her skin and became so hot that it left an actual burn mark on her finger. She screamed loud enough to be heard 3 blocks away, and they threatened to sue me for assault before storming out and posting negative reviews on every website they could find. I started keeping detailed records of every supernatural incident, including dates, times, witnesses, and specific items involved, approaching the problem like I would any other research project at the museum. The pattern that emerged was deeply troubling. Every single incident involved items from our most valuable collection, pieces worth $10,000 or more that were specifically mentioned in Grandma's detailed inventory records. When I cross-referenced the incidents with my grandmother's documentation, I discovered that several of the most expensive items were completely missing from the shop, including a Civil War-era military sword worth $15,000, a Victorian warning jewelry set valued at $12,000, and a collection of occult books from the 1800s that Grandma had priced at $20,000. The missing items were all pieces that Marco had specifically asked about during his first few weeks helping at the shop, claiming he wanted to understand their historical significance and market value. At the time, I thought his interest was genuine curiosity, but now it seemed like he had been conducting an inventory of the most profitable items to steal. I confronted Marco about the missing pieces that Friday afternoon when he arrived for his usual early shift, and his reaction convinced me that my suspicions were correct. Instead of expressing surprise or concern about the theft, he immediately became defensive and started accusing me of misplacing things due to inexperience and stress. "Emma, you have been running around here like a chicken with its head cut off for 3 months, moving things from room to room and forgetting where you put them," Marco said, his voice getting louder with each word. Just because you cannot find something does not mean it was stolen. It means you need to get organized and stop blaming other people for your mistakes. These are not mistakes, Marco. I have detailed photographs of every display case and inventory lists with specific locations for each item. The Civil War sword was locked in the main display case 3 weeks ago, and now the case is empty except for a note saying the piece is being professionally cleaned, but I never authorized any cleaning services. Maybe Grandma arranged for cleaning services before she died and forgot to tell you about it. Or maybe you moved the sword somewhere else and forgot about it because you have been drinking too much wine upstairs to deal with the stress. The accusation about drinking was particularly insulting because Marco knew I rarely drank alcohol, and had told me he was deflecting blame to avoid admitting his own guilt. His suggestion about Grandma arranging services was obviously false because I had reviewed all of her financial records and correspondence when settling the estate, and there were no contracts or payments for restoration work. Show me the cleaning service receipts then, Marco. If Grandma arranged for restoration work, there would be documentation and contact information for the company doing the work. I do not have to prove anything to you, Emma. You inherited this place 3 months ago and already managed to drive away half the customers with your paranoid behavior and conspiracy theories. Maybe the problem is not missing inventory. Maybe the problem is that you have no idea how to run a business. Marco stormed out of the shop after that argument, and I spent the weekend conducting a complete inventory of every valuable item in the building. The results were worse than I had feared. Over $50,000 worth of merchandise was missing, all of it from pieces that would be difficult to replace and easy to sell to private collectors who did not ask too many questions about provenance. The missing items included not just individual pieces but entire collections that Grandma had spent decades acquiring, like a complete set of tarot cards from 1700s France, a collection of medieval religious artifacts, and several pieces of Native American pottery that were probably worth more than my original estimate. Each missing item was something that Marco had specifically asked about or examined closely during his time helping at the shop. I filed a police report that Monday morning, but Officer Rodriguez explained that proving theft would be extremely difficult without witnesses or evidence of forced entry, especially since Marco had legitimate access to the shop and could claim he was moving items for legitimate business purposes. The insurance policy would cover some losses, but only if I could prove the items were stolen rather than misplaced or damaged, which required the kind of documentation I was unlikely to get. Your best option is to confront your stepbrother directly and try to get him to admit what he did, preferably while recording the conversation, Officer Rodriguez suggested. If he confesses to taking the items, or if you can prove he sold them, then we have grounds for theft charges. Otherwise, this is going to be treated as a family dispute rather than a criminal matter. That same afternoon, while researching legal options for recovering stolen property, I received a phone call that changed everything I thought I understood about the situation. The caller identified himself as Dr. Marcus Pennington, a professor of religious studies at Portland State University who specialized in occult practices and supernatural phenomena, which seemed like exactly the kind of expertise I needed. Ms. Westfield, I hope you do not mind me calling out of the blue, but I've been researching some unusual purchases made by members of a group I am investigating, and your shop name appeared in several financial records, Dr. Pennington explained. I understand you recently inherited the business, and I was wondering if you might be willing to discuss some items that were sold from your inventory over the past 2 months. What kind of group are you investigating, and how did you get access to financial records mentioning my shop? I am working with law enforcement to document the activities of what appears to be an occult organization that specifically seeks out cursed or haunted objects for use in supernatural rituals. Several members have made significant purchases from Westfield Antiques recently, and the timing coincides with reports of increased paranormal activity in your area. Dr. Pennington agreed to meet me at the shop that evening after closing time, and when he arrived, he brought documentation that completely reframed everything I thought I knew about Marco's theft and the escalating supernatural chaos. According to his research, at least 6 different buyers had purchased items from my shop through private sales arrangements, all of them paying premium prices for objects specifically described as being haunted or cursed. The buyers were all members of something called the Circle of Eternal Shadows, which Dr. Pennington described as a wealthy occult society that collected supernatural artifacts for use in rituals designed to amplify paranormal activity. The group believed that cursed objects could serve as conduits for spiritual energy, and they were willing to pay significantly above market value for pieces with documented supernatural histories. Your stepbrother has been advertising on private collector websites, specifically marketing items as being authentically haunted and guaranteed to produce supernatural phenomena, Dr. Pennington explained while showing me printouts of online listings. He has sold at least 12 pieces for a total of approximately $60,000, all to members of this organization. The online listings were posted under Marco's name and included photographs of items I recognized from the shop, along with detailed descriptions of their supernatural properties and histories of paranormal activity. A Victorian jewelry box was described as containing the vengeful spirit of a woman who died under suspicious circumstances, while a collection of medieval manuscripts was advertised as being cursed by monks who practiced forbidden rituals. The problem is that this group does not just collect these items for display purposes, Dr. Pennington continued. They use them in rituals specifically designed to increase supernatural activity and create what they call spiritual vortexes that attract additional paranormal entities. By selling them your grandmother's most powerful artifacts, your stepbrother has essentially provided them with the tools to turn your shop into a supernatural battleground. The revelation that Marco was not just stealing valuable antiques but actively marketing them to people who wanted to use them for occult practices made his betrayal infinitely worse. He was not just destroying Grandma's business for quick profit, he was desecrating her memory by turning her carefully curated collection into props for supernatural exploitation. Is there any way to reverse the effects of what they have been doing, or are we stuck with permanent paranormal chaos? The good news is that most supernatural activity is tied to specific objects rather than locations, which means recovering the stolen items should significantly reduce the phenomena you have been experiencing. The bad news is that this group will not voluntarily return anything they have purchased, and they have probably been conducting rituals to strengthen the supernatural properties of each piece. Dr. Pennington suggested that our best option was to document the current paranormal activity at the shop and use that evidence to pressure both Marco and the buyers into returning the stolen items and compensating me for damages. If we could prove that the theft was part of a larger conspiracy to defraud insurance companies and exploit supernatural phenomena, law enforcement would have grounds for more serious charges than simple theft. These people are wealthy and sophisticated, but they are also participating in fraud and potentially practicing illegal religious activities on private property without permission. If we can document their involvement and the escalating supernatural phenomena, we can create enough legal pressure to force them to cooperate. We spent the next 3 days turning the shop into a supernatural research facility, using digital cameras, audio recording equipment, and temperature monitors to document every paranormal incident in detail. Dr. Pennington brought in a team of graduate students who specialized in supernatural phenomena, and together we created a comprehensive record of the supernatural chaos that had been escalating since Marco started selling cursed items to collectors. The documentation process was both terrifying and oddly therapeutic, like finally having validation that the supernatural experiences were real rather than products of stress and imagination. We recorded dramatic temperature fluctuations, objects moving on their own, disembodied voices speaking in languages none of us recognized, and several instances of electronic equipment malfunctioning when supernatural entities appeared to be present. On Thursday evening, while reviewing hours of recorded footage, we captured something that changed the entire investigation. Around 2 a.m, a figure appeared in the shop despite all doors and windows being locked and the alarm system being armed. The figure moved through the showroom examining items with a flashlight, and when we enhanced the video footage, we could clearly identify Marco using a key to enter through the back door. He is still stealing things, even after you confronted him about the missing inventory, Dr. Pennington observed while replaying the footage. This suggests the buyers are making specific requests for additional items, probably because their rituals are requiring more powerful artifacts to maintain the supernatural phenomena. We decided to confront Marco the next morning with all of our evidence, including the surveillance footage, documentation of his online sales listings, and proof of his connection to the occult organization. Dr. Pennington suggested recording the conversation and demanding that Marco contact his buyers to arrange for the return of all stolen items within 72 hours or face criminal charges for theft and fraud. Marco arrived at his usual early hour on Friday morning, and we were waiting for him in the main showroom with all of our documentation spread across the front counter. His reaction when he saw Dr. Pennington and the surveillance equipment told us everything we needed to know about his guilt and awareness of what he had been doing. Marco, we need to have a serious conversation about the items you have been stealing from this shop and selling to members of an occult organization, I began, activating the recording app on my phone. Dr. Pennington has documented your sales activities, and we have surveillance footage of you entering the building after hours to steal additional merchandise. I do not know what you are talking about, Emma. I have been helping you run this business, and if you want to start making accusations, maybe I should just stop coming around and let you figure things out on your own. Marco, we have copies of your online sales listings describing stolen items as authentically cursed and guaranteed to produce supernatural phenomena, Dr. Pennington interjected, sliding the printouts across the counter. We also have financial records showing payments from 6 different buyers, all members of an organization that specializes in occult practices. Marco's face went pale when he saw the documentation, and for several seconds he said nothing while reading through the evidence of his activities. When he finally responded, his voice was defensive but less confident than before, like he was trying to convince himself as much as us. Those buyers approached me directly and offered premium prices for items they claimed had historical significance for their religious practices. I never advertised anything as being cursed or haunted. I just described the historical background and let them draw their own conclusions about supernatural properties. Marco, your online listings specifically use phrases like vengeful spirit, cursed by monks, and guaranteed supernatural phenomena, I pointed out, reading directly from the printouts. You also describe yourself as a specialist in occult artifacts and offer consulting services for people seeking authentically haunted objects for ritual purposes. Look, these people are willing to pay 3 times the normal market value for items they think are supernatural, and I figured if they want to waste their money on superstitious nonsense, that was their choice. The shop was losing money every month, and I was trying to help you generate enough income to pay the bills and keep Grandma's business running. The admission that he had been deliberately marketing items as supernatural artifacts to exploit buyers' beliefs was exactly what we needed to prove fraud charges, but his justification that he was helping the business made me angrier than anything else he had said during the entire confrontation. You are not helping the business, Marco. Your theft and the supernatural chaos it created drove away our regular customers and destroyed our reputation in the community. The paranormal activity escalated because your buyers have been using stolen items and rituals designed to amplify supernatural phenomena, which means you turned Grandma's shop into a testing ground for occult experiments. Dr. Pennington explained how the Circle of Eternal Shadows operated and why they were willing to pay premium prices for items with documented supernatural histories, emphasizing that their rituals were specifically designed to increase paranormal activity rather than simply collecting artifacts for display purposes. The group believed that concentrated supernatural energy could be harvested and used to enhance their own psychic abilities and spiritual power. Your buyers have been conducting rituals at off-site locations to strengthen the supernatural properties of each stolen item, then using the enhanced artifacts to create spiritual vortexes that attract additional paranormal entities, Dr. Pennington explained. They have essentially turned your grandmother's antique collection into components for supernatural weapons. Marco's reaction to this information was immediate skepticism and dismissive laughter, which confirmed that he had never bothered to research what his buyers actually intended to do with the stolen items. His focus had been entirely on the profit margins and premium prices, without any consideration for the consequences of his actions. Come on, Dr. Pennington, you are talking about wealthy collectors who like to play with crystals and tarot cards, not some kind of supernatural terrorist organization. These people have more money than sense, and if they want to pretend their antiques are magic, that does not make them dangerous. Marco, the supernatural phenomena in this shop have escalated to the point where customers are being physically injured and traumatized by paranormal encounters. A woman was burned by a ring that turned black against her skin, and multiple people have experienced violent nausea and psychological distress. This is not harmless role-playing. This is causing real harm to real people. We presented Marco with an ultimatum backed by all of our documentation and Dr. Pennington's connections with law enforcement. He had 72 hours to contact his buyers and arrange for the return of all stolen items, along with financial compensation for the damage caused to the business and the customers who were injured. If he refused to cooperate, we would file criminal charges for theft, fraud, and endangering public safety. You can frame this as discovering that your buyers were using the items for purposes you never intended and demanding their return to prevent further supernatural chaos, Dr. Pennington suggested. Most occult practitioners prefer to avoid legal scrutiny, so they will probably cooperate if you make it clear that continued possession of stolen goods will result in criminal investigation. Marco agreed to contact his buyers and explain the situation, but insisted that he could not guarantee they would voluntarily return items they had purchased in good faith for premium prices. His lack of confidence about recovering the stolen merchandise suggested that he understood exactly what kind of people he had been dealing with, despite his earlier claims about them being harmless collectors. "I will reach out to everyone and explain that there have been complications with the estate settlement and that some items were sold without proper authorization," Marco said, finally admitting that he had never had legal authority to sell anything from the shop. "But if they refuse to return things or demand refunds, I do not have $60,000 to pay them back, so we might have to involve lawyers to sort everything out." The admission that Marco had sold $60,000 worth of stolen merchandise was higher than our previous estimates and included items I had not even realized were missing yet. It also confirmed that he had been systematically looting the shop for months rather than making impulsive decisions about a few valuable pieces, which made his actions premeditated theft rather than opportunistic crime. Over the weekend, while Marco attempted to contact his buyers and arrange for returns, Dr. Pennington and I continued documenting supernatural activity and researching legal options for recovering stolen property from occult organizations. The paranormal phenomena actually intensified during this period, probably because the Circle of Eternal Shadows realized their supply source was being threatened and increased their ritual activities. On Sunday night, we recorded the most dramatic supernatural incident since the investigation began. Dozens of objects moved simultaneously throughout the shop, creating a cacophony of crashes and impacts that could be heard from the street. When we reviewed the footage, we could see books flying from shelves, furniture sliding across the floor, and display cases opening and closing rapidly, as if invisible hands were frantically searching for something specific. This level of coordinated supernatural activity suggests that multiple entities are being directed by an external force, probably through rituals being conducted off-site, Dr. Pennington explained while reviewing the footage. The Circle of Eternal Shadows is almost certainly using your stolen items to create a spiritual connection to this location, which allows them to manipulate supernatural phenomena from a distance. Monday morning brought both good news and bad news from Marco's attempts to contact his buyers and arrange for returns. The good news was that 3 of the 6 buyers agreed to return items immediately rather than risk legal complications, understanding that continued possession of stolen goods could result in criminal charges. The bad news was that the remaining 3 buyers, including the apparent leader of the organization, refused to cooperate and threatened legal action if we continued to harass their members. The guy who seems to be in charge of their group, someone called Alexander Thornfield, basically told me to go to hell and said they have lawyers who specialize in religious freedom cases, Marco reported, looking more nervous than I had ever seen him. He also said something about the items being consecrated for sacred purposes and that returning them would constitute religious persecution. Dr. Pennington was familiar with Alexander Thornfield and described him as a wealthy businessman who had been investigated multiple times for fraud and exploitation of vulnerable people seeking spiritual guidance. Thornfield owned several properties around Portland where the Circle of Eternal Shadows conducted their rituals, and he had a history of using legal intimidation to avoid accountability for his actions. Thornfield is smart enough to frame everything in terms of religious freedom and persecution, which makes law enforcement reluctant to get involved without overwhelming evidence of criminal activity, Dr. Pennington explained. However, he also has a reputation for backing down when faced with serious legal pressure, especially if there is risk of public exposure and media attention. We decided to escalate our approach by contacting local media outlets and offering to provide documentation of the supernatural phenomena and the theft investigation, framing the story as a small business owner being victimized by an occult organization that exploited family tragedy for profit. The threat of negative publicity would put pressure on Thornfield and his organization to cooperate, while also generating public sympathy for our situation. I reached out to Channel 7 News and the Portland Tribune with our story, providing photographs of the damaged shop, recordings of supernatural phenomena, and documentation of Marco's sales activities. Both outlets were immediately interested in the story, particularly the angle about wealthy occult practitioners exploiting a family business and causing supernatural chaos in a popular shopping district. The news coverage aired on Wednesday evening and generated immediate public attention, with dozens of people calling the shop to offer support and share their own experiences with supernatural phenomena. Several former customers called to apologize for avoiding the shop and explained that they had experienced disturbing supernatural encounters but assumed they were imagining things due to the unusual atmosphere. More importantly, the media attention prompted Alexander Thornfield to contact me directly and offer to negotiate a resolution that would avoid further public scrutiny of his organization's activities. His tone was polite but threatening, suggesting that continued media coverage would result in legal action for defamation and harassment, but also indicating willingness to discuss returning some items to resolve the dispute. Ms. Westfield, I understand there has been some confusion about the provenance of certain artifacts purchased from your establishment, and I will be willing to meet with you to discuss a mutually beneficial resolution, Thornfield said during our phone conversation. However, I must insist that you cease making public statements that characterize my organization as criminal or exploitative, as such statements are both inaccurate and potentially libelous. We agreed to meet at the shop on Thursday evening, with Dr. Pennington present as a witness and mediator, to discuss terms for returning the stolen items and compensating me for damages. I insisted that Marco also attend the meeting to verify which items were sold to Thornfield's organization and confirm the financial arrangements they had made. Thornfield arrived at the appointed time accompanied by 2 other members of his organization, both wearing expensive business suits and carrying leather briefcases that suggested they were prepared for serious negotiations. His appearance was exactly what I expected from someone who ran a wealthy occult society, middle-aged, impeccably groomed, and radiating the kind of confidence that comes from having enough money to solve most problems. Ms. Westfield, I want to begin by expressing my condolences for the loss of your grandmother and my regret that this situation has caused distress for your business, Thornfield began, his voice smooth and practiced like a politician delivering a prepared statement. My organization has great respect for historical artifacts and the families who preserve them, and we never intended to cause problems for your establishment. Mr. Thornfield, my stepbrother sold you items worth over $20,000 without authorization, and your organization has been using those stolen items in rituals that have caused dangerous supernatural phenomena in my shop. Multiple customers have been injured, and my business reputation has been destroyed by the paranormal activity that escalated after your purchases. I understand your frustration, Ms. Westfield, but I must point out that my organization purchased those items in good faith from someone who represented himself as having authority to sell them. We have receipts and documentation proving that all transactions were conducted legally, and we have invested significant resources in incorporating those artifacts into our spiritual practices. Thornfield's associates opened their briefcases and produced detailed documentation of every purchase they had made from Marco, including receipts, photographs, and certificates of authenticity that Marco had apparently created to justify the premium prices. The paperwork was professionally prepared and designed to legitimize the transactions, suggesting that Thornfield's organization was experienced in acquiring questionable items through legal loopholes. The challenge we face is that these artifacts have become integral to our religious practices, and returning them would constitute a significant spiritual and financial loss for our community, Thornfield continued. However, I am prepared to offer compensation for any inconvenience this situation has caused, along with assurances that our future spiritual activities will not create disturbances for your business. Dr. Pennington interrupted to explain that the supernatural phenomena were directly linked to the stolen items and would continue to escalate as long as Thornfield's organization continued their ritual activities, making financial compensation inadequate to resolve the problem. The only solution was complete return of all stolen items and cessation of any supernatural practices involving artifacts from the shop. Mr. Thornfield, the paranormal activity at this location has increased dramatically since your purchases, and our documentation shows a direct correlation between your ritual schedule and the intensity of supernatural phenomena, Dr. Pennington stated, presenting our research findings. Continued possession of those items will result in ongoing supernatural chaos that threatens public safety and violates numerous municipal ordinances regarding public disturbances. Thornfield's reaction to Dr. Pennington's presentation was immediate skepticism and dismissive laughter, similar to Marco's earlier response when confronted with evidence of supernatural phenomena. His organization clearly believed in the supernatural properties of the artifacts they collected, but they seemed to view the consequences for other people as irrelevant to their spiritual goals. Dr. Pennington, I respect your academic credentials, but I find it difficult to believe that our private spiritual practices are somehow responsible for supernatural disturbances at a separate location several miles away. Correlation does not imply causation, and there could be numerous explanations for the phenomena you have documented. Mr. Thornfield, your organization specifically seeks out cursed objects because you believe they can amplify supernatural activity and create spiritual vortexes that attract paranormal entities. The logical consequence of using stolen artifacts in such rituals is that supernatural phenomena will manifest at their original location, particularly if that location has historical significance or existing spiritual energy. The negotiation continued for over 2 hours, with Thornfield alternating between polite cooperation and subtle threats about legal action if we continued to pressure his organization. His associates took detailed notes of everything we said and occasionally whispered consultations that suggested they were developing strategy for potential litigation. But Thornfield also seemed genuinely concerned about continued media attention and public scrutiny. Eventually, we reached a compromise agreement that satisfied most of our demands while allowing Thornfield to save face with his organization. He agreed to return all items purchased from Marco within 1 week, along with payment of $15,000 in compensation for business losses and customer injuries. In exchange, I would cease all media interviews and public statements about the case, and Dr. Pennington would limit his research publications to academic contexts that did not identify individuals or organizations by name. I want to emphasize that this agreement represents good faith cooperation rather than admission of wrongdoing by my organization, Thornfield stated while signing the written settlement. We are returning these items as a gesture of respect for your family's loss and to prevent further misunderstandings about our spiritual practices. The items were returned the following Tuesday in a single delivery truck that arrived at dawn when the street was mostly empty of pedestrians and other businesses were still closed. Thornfield's associates worked quickly and efficiently to unload boxes and carefully transport them into the shop, treating each item with what appeared to be genuine reverence and respect for their historical significance. As soon as the stolen items were back in their original locations throughout the shop, the supernatural phenomena began to subside dramatically, confirming Dr. Pennington's theories about the connection between the artifacts and the paranormal activity. The temperature fluctuations stopped within hours, and by the end of the week, customers were able to browse comfortably without experiencing supernatural disturbances. Marco was arrested the following month on charges of theft, fraud, and conspiracy, though he ultimately accepted a plea agreement that included restitution, community service, and probation rather than jail time. The district attorney explained that prosecuting cases involving supernatural elements was extremely difficult, but the financial fraud and theft charges were straightforward enough to ensure a conviction with the documentation we had provided. Your stepbrother has agreed to pay back the money he received from selling stolen items, and he will be prohibited from entering your business or contacting you directly for the duration of his probation, Assistant District Attorney Williams explained during our final meeting. The conspiracy charges against the occult organization were dropped in exchange for their cooperation in returning the stolen items and compensating you for damages. The insurance settlement took several more months to finalize, but eventually covered most of the financial losses from the theft and the damaged business reputation. Several customers who had been injured during supernatural encounters also received compensation through Thornfield's organization, which helped rebuild community trust and demonstrate that I was serious about customer safety and satisfaction. By the end of the year, Westfield Antiques was back to generating steady profits and maintaining the kind of reputation for quality and authenticity that Grandma Rosalie had spent 40 years building. The quarterly rent payments of $35,000 were no longer a source of constant anxiety, and I was actually able to start setting aside money for expansion and improvement projects. Dr. Pennington became a regular consultant for the shop, helping me research the historical background and potential supernatural properties of new acquisitions before adding them to inventory. His expertise proved invaluable for avoiding items with problematic histories and ensuring that customers could browse safely without risk of supernatural encounters or paranormal disturbances. The key is understanding that not all antique items carry supernatural energy, but certain objects that were involved in traumatic events or religious practices can retain spiritual imprints that affect sensitive individuals, Dr. Pennington explained during one of our monthly inventory consultations. By documenting the provenance and history of each piece, we can identify potentially problematic items and take appropriate precautions. We developed a classification system for supernatural risk levels that allowed me to price items appropriately and provide accurate information to customers who were specifically seeking or avoiding objects with paranormal histories. Items with documented supernatural activity were stored in a separate section with appropriate warnings and premium pricing, while pieces with clean histories were displayed in the main showroom for general browsing. The supernatural incident had an unexpected positive effect on business, as word spread through the paranormal investigation community about our experience with the Circle of Eternal Shadows and the successful resolution of the case. Legitimate researchers and collectors began seeking out the shop specifically because of our documented expertise in identifying and handling supernatural artifacts safely and responsibly. Mrs. Chen returned as a regular customer within 6 months, bringing friends and family members who were interested in purchasing authentic antique jewelry and decorative items. She even wrote a positive review on our website praising the improved atmosphere and professional handling of customer concerns, which helped offset some of the negative publicity from the supernatural incidents. "I can tell the difference immediately when I walk through the door now," Mrs. Chen told me during her first visit after the resolution. "The heavy feeling is completely gone, and the shop feels welcoming and peaceful again, just like it did when your grandmother was running things." Marco attempted to contact me several times during his probation period, apparently hoping to reconcile and possibly resume helping with the business, but I made it clear that his betrayal had permanently damaged our relationship beyond any possibility of repair. His theft and deception had not just cost money and customers, it had violated the trust that Grandma Rosalie had placed in our family to preserve her legacy with integrity and respect. "I understand you might eventually forgive Marco for what he did, but that does not mean you have to allow him back into your life or business," Dr. Pennington advised when I mentioned the attempted reconciliation. "Some betrayals are so fundamental that they change relationships permanently, and protecting yourself and your business is more important than maintaining family harmony." The wooden box that had been the center of the most intense supernatural activity remained locked and stored in a secure location upstairs, along with Grandma's note warning that it should never be opened under any circumstances. Dr. Pennington agreed that some artifacts were too dangerous to display or sell, regardless of their potential value, and should be preserved safely for future research or eventual donation to academic institutions. "Your grandmother clearly understood that certain objects require special handling and should not be treated as ordinary merchandise," Dr. Pennington observed while examining the box during one of our consultations. "The fact that she kept it locked and warned against opening it suggests she had direct experience with its supernatural properties and made a conscious decision to contain rather than exploit them." 1 year after inheriting the shop, I hosted a memorial celebration for Grandma Rosalie in the main showroom, inviting longtime customers, local business owners, and community members who had known her during her 4 decades running Westfield Antiques. The event was both a tribute to her memory and a demonstration that the shop had recovered from the supernatural chaos and was once again a safe and welcoming place for everyone. "Rosalie would be proud to see how you handled this situation and protected the integrity of her business," said Mr. Thompson, who had been buying Depression-era furniture from Grandma for over 20 years. "She always said the most important thing was treating customers with honesty and respect, and you proved that family legacy is more important than quick profits." The financial recovery exceeded my expectations, with annual revenue reaching $120,000 by the end of the first year, significantly higher than the shop had generated during Grandma's final years when her health was declining. The combination of restored customer confidence, media attention from the supernatural investigation, and our new reputation for expertise in paranormal artifacts created multiple revenue streams that strengthened the business considerably. I also discovered that my museum training had prepared me well for the research and authentication aspects of running an antique business, skills that proved especially valuable when dealing with customers who were seeking specific types of historical artifacts for legitimate collecting purposes. The ability to verify provenance and historical accuracy became a major competitive advantage in a market where authenticity was increasingly difficult to guarantee. "Your grandmother chose the right person to inherit this business," Dr. Pennington said during our final consultation meeting. "You have the knowledge and integrity to preserve the historical value of these artifacts while also protecting people from potential supernatural dangers. That combination of expertise and ethical responsibility is extremely rare in this field." The insurance settlement and compensation from Thornfield's organization ultimately totaled over $40,000, which I used to upgrade security systems, improve climate control for preserving delicate items, and create a small research library where customers could learn about the historical background of pieces they were considering purchasing. These improvements helped establish Westfield Antiques as a premier destination for serious collectors and casual browsers alike. Looking back on the entire experience, I realized that Marco's betrayal and the supernatural chaos it created actually forced me to develop skills and relationships that made the business stronger than it had ever been during Grandma's final years. The crisis taught me to trust my instincts, document everything carefully, and seek expert advice when dealing with situations beyond my immediate expertise. The relationship with Dr. Pennington and his research team also opened opportunities for consulting work with other antique dealers and collectors who needed help identifying potentially problematic items or investigating supernatural phenomena. This additional income stream helped offset the seasonal fluctuations that were typical in the antique business and provided financial stability during slower periods. The most important lesson from this experience is that supernatural phenomena are often connected to human behavior and can be resolved through careful investigation and appropriate action, Dr. Pennington explained during one of our final meetings. The Circle of Eternal Shadows was able to manipulate paranormal activity because they understood the connection between spiritual energy and specific artifacts, but that same understanding allowed us to reverse their influence and restore balance. 2 years after the supernatural crisis, Westfield Antiques was featured in Portland Monthly magazine as one of the city's most interesting small businesses, with a full-page article describing our unique expertise in historical authentication and supernatural artifact consultation. The publicity brought customers from throughout the Pacific Northwest and established the shop as a destination for serious collectors seeking both historical accuracy and peace of mind. The article included a brief mention of the supernatural incident and its resolution, framed as an example of how small business owners can overcome unexpected challenges through community support and expert consultation. Marco was not mentioned by name, but the story emphasized the importance of family trust and ethical business practices in maintaining customer relationships and community reputation. Emma Westfield has transformed a family tragedy into a success story that honors her grandmother's legacy while establishing new standards for authenticity and customer safety in the antique business, the magazine article concluded. Her combination of museum expertise and supernatural investigation experience makes Westfield Antiques a unique resource for collectors and researchers throughout the region. The financial success allowed me to purchase the building from the landlord when it went up for sale, eliminating the monthly rent payments that had been my biggest source of anxiety during the first year. Owning the property provided long-term security and the opportunity to make improvements that would increase both the value of the business and the comfort of customers and employees. I hired 2 part-time employees to help with inventory management and customer service, freeing up time for research and authentication work that required my museum training and experience. Both employees were graduate students in history and art history programs who appreciated the opportunity to work with authentic historical artifacts and learn about the antique business from an educational perspective. Working at Westfield Antiques has been like getting a master class in historical research and artifact authentication, said Jennifer Martinez, one of my part-time employees who specialized in Victorian-era decorative arts. The combination of academic research and practical business experience has been incredibly valuable for my career development. The supernatural consultation services developed into a legitimate sideline business, with Dr. Pennington and I collaborating on cases involving potentially haunted objects and unexplained paranormal phenomena at other antique shops and private collections. Our success with the Circle of Eternal Shadows case established our credibility in both academic and law enforcement circles, leading to referrals from insurance companies and legal firms dealing with similar situations. The demand for legitimate supernatural investigation and artifact consultation is much higher than most people realize, Dr. Pennington explained during one of our monthly business reviews. There are dozens of cases every year involving disputed supernatural phenomena, insurance claims for paranormal damage, and legal disputes over cursed objects, but very few qualified experts who can provide credible documentation and analysis. 3 years after inheriting the shop, I received a letter from Alexander Thornfield informing me that the Circle of Eternal Shadows was dissolving due to internal conflicts and legal pressures from multiple investigations into their activities. He offered to sell me several rare artifacts that his organization had acquired over the years, suggesting that Westfield Antiques would be a more appropriate home for items with significant historical and supernatural importance. Ms. Westfield, your handling of our previous dispute demonstrated a level of professionalism and integrity that I believe would serve these artifacts well, Thornfield wrote in his letter. Rather than allow them to be dispersed through estate sales or auction houses that lack expertise in supernatural matters, I would prefer to offer them to someone who understands their significance and can ensure appropriate care and placement. I declined Thornfield's offer after consulting with Dr. Pennington and reviewing documentation of the items he wanted to sell, most of which had questionable provenance and documented histories of causing supernatural disturbances for previous owners. The decision to refuse the business opportunity was based on lessons learned from the original crisis about the importance of carefully vetting both items and customers to avoid future problems. The fact that Thornfield reached out to you demonstrates that your reputation for handling supernatural artifacts responsibly has spread throughout the collector community, Dr. Pennington observed. However, his organization's dissolution suggests that their practices were ultimately unsustainable, and accepting items from that source could create liability and reputation risks that outweigh any potential profits. Today, for years after inheriting Grandma Rosalie's antique shop, Westfield Antiques generates over $150,000 in annual revenue and employs 4 part-time staff members who help with everything from research and authentication to customer service and inventory management. The business has expanded to include online sales, supernatural consultation services, and educational workshops for collectors and enthusiasts. The wooden box that started the entire supernatural crisis remains locked and secured in the upstairs apartment, along with Grandma's warning and detailed documentation of its history and potential dangers. Dr. Pennington and I agree that some artifacts are too powerful and unpredictable to ever be displayed or sold, regardless of their potential value or historical significance. Your grandmother's decision to keep that box locked and warned against opening it probably prevented decades of supernatural chaos and potential injuries to customers and employees, Dr. Pennington said during our most recent consultation. The fact that you have honored her wishes and maintained those precautions demonstrates the kind of ethical responsibility that separates legitimate businesses from exploitation operations like the Circle of Eternal Shadows. The most satisfying aspect of the entire experience has been proving that Grandma Rosalie made the right choice in leaving the business to me rather than Marco, despite his initial resentment and legal challenges to the will. Her faith in my ability to preserve the shop's integrity and historical mission has been validated by 4 years of steady growth and community recognition for quality and authenticity. Marco completed his probation successfully and eventually moved to Seattle to start over with a new career in real estate, apparently having learned enough from his mistakes to avoid future criminal activity. We have had no contact since the legal proceedings concluded, and I have no interest in reconciliation or forgiveness. Some betrayals are simply too fundamental to overcome regardless of family relationships. The best revenge against people who try to exploit or manipulate you is simply succeeding without them, Dr. Pennington advised when I mentioned Marco's departure from Portland. Your success with Westfield Antiques proves that integrity and hard work ultimately triumph over shortcuts and betrayal, which is probably the most important lesson anyone can learn from this experience. The shop continues to attract customers who appreciate both the historical significance of our inventory and the peace of mind that comes from knowing every item has been carefully researched and authenticated by experts. The supernatural consultation services have expanded to include insurance investigations, legal testimony, and academic research collaborations that provide additional revenue while contributing to legitimate scholarship in paranormal studies. Looking back on everything that happened, I am grateful that Marco's betrayal and the supernatural crisis forced me to develop expertise and relationships that ultimately made Westfield Antiques stronger and more successful than it had ever been. Grandma Rosalie's 40-year legacy has been preserved and enhanced, and her trust in my ability to maintain the shop's integrity has been proven correct through 4 years of steady growth and community recognition. The antique business has taught me that the most valuable things in life cannot be stolen or sold. They can only be preserved through dedication, respect, and understanding of their true significance. Every item in the shop represents someone's history and memories, and my responsibility is to ensure that those stories are honored and protected for future generations to discover and appreciate. That responsibility extends beyond just running a profitable business to serving as a guardian of historical artifacts and cultural heritage, ensuring that the past remains accessible to people who want to learn from it and connect with the experiences of previous generations. It is exactly the kind of work that Grandma Rosalie devoted her life to, and exactly the kind of legacy that makes her memory worth preserving and continuing. Today, when I unlock the front door of Westfield Antiques each morning and see the carefully arranged displays of historical artifacts waiting for customers to discover them, I know that I have succeeded in honoring both Grandma's memory and her faith in my ability to carry on her life's work. The supernatural chaos and family betrayal that threatened to destroy everything ultimately led to growth, success, and the kind of satisfaction that comes from doing difficult work with integrity and dedication. Sometimes the best way to honor the people we love is simply to prove that their faith in us was justified, regardless of how many obstacles and betrayals we encounter along the way.